So welcome everyone, particularly welcome to Davide Quayola, of course, all the way from London. He comes from Rome, and I suppose all of you, at least somewhat acquainted with his work, will also see perhaps the connection or the fact that part of the work rooted or inspired or draws on that enormously rich art world. Davide ended up in London where he took a degree at the University of the Arts, and that led, as we know, to a career, very, very complex career with computer-generated art, picking up pictures, sculptures, video installations, as well as live performances. And the work has been exhibited, the installations have been put up, and the performances held just about all over the world. And I also believe you travel quite a bit to lecture, like here. The work includes as well collaborations with sound specialists and composers, as well as extensive use of fabrication techniques. That basically includes robots, and that's to produce also live, in fact, I think that was in Stockholm or in Sweden, a sculpture in art performances. The work investigates dialogues under unscripted conditions, tensions between the real and artificial, arriving at a form of equilibrium, but a sort of hybrid condition, the figurative and the abstract, the old and the new, and transforms it part when it uses classical art, transforms that into the sort of digital settings. The processing of images of existing artwork with commercial software as well as algorithms, the underlying process, and basically uses geometry to abstract the pictorial material to develop its own stunning work. You have said, I'm interested in how an old object could be looked at again. You have also stated about your work, digitally produced, that it reflects the digital changes. It reflects how digital changes the way that we look at the world. Technology, you have argued, is not just there to serve something, which was I mentioned outside, something you see as a collaborator, so to speak, making the process itself almost discovery. And I suppose also that is part and parcel of it, that the digital is a realm unto itself that you explore both in the work and in the processes. So I really would like to that you are here, and looking very much forward to seeing your work.
Hello. Hello. So, strange, because you already said so many things. Now I'm going to repeat some of those, but yeah, certainly it's a pleasure to be here, and it's kind of strange, this connection that is developing with architecture, which in fact it's kind of always been there in a way, and more and more I seem to have architects that find what I do interesting. As you said, I started teaching also the Bartlett architecture, also without really any true qualifications, because actually I'm not really an architect. But I guess the fact that I'm teaching there, or the fact that I'm here talking to you, I think also it's just a kind of interesting reflection of maybe what architecture really is, or what is, I guess perhaps the role of the architect, or the role of architecture today, or where is the line between architecture, design, art, music, and so on. So yeah, I guess I'm a visual artist. I tend to be interested in developing systems. Generally, there is some kind of procedure in my work where there is a given subject that I'm interested in exploring, and there's a system that I develop in order to study and explore such subjects. And the artworks are really the sort of findings of such explorations that are then combined and put together. But very rarely there is a beginning or an end to a project. Rather, it's this kind of continuous streams of research. So what I'm going to show you today, it's maybe somehow two different streams of research that have been following for several years. But let's kind of go back to architecture. That's for me, in a way, how everything started, how I really started being interested in this topic of form and geometry, being interested in what is not necessarily really real or belongs to the sort of lived experience. Started being interested in working with computers. My brother is about 10 years older than me. Started studying architecture when I was about 11. Bought a computer, bought a lot of books. At the time there was this kind of deconstructivist sort of researches, and I remember really falling in love with these studies from, again, Zaha, from Peter Eisenman, and from Libeskind, and so on, from many architects that somehow I started becoming very interested, and I started exploring this kind of concepts and on a computer with this sort of architecture visualization softwares. I was so into it that it seemed to my parents and my brother that it would be very clear that I would be actually studying architecture. I ended up doing most of the renders for my brother's thesis. At the time, I kind of got quite into that. But actually, the more I got into that, the more I realized I wasn't really interested in architecture. In fact, I didn't even know what architecture really meant or was. I mean, my understanding of this was through images of architecture. And essentially, that's what I was interested in images about architecture, which is something sort of strange. I mean, if you look at these three, architecturally speaking, I mean, they're very different things. One is a painting, a drawing, one is a render, one is a real building. But actually, for me, they speak exactly the same language, or they spoke also, at the time, exactly the same language. I started really becoming interested in exploring this relationship between form and geometry, and specifically even more in a way of things that couldn't really exist in the real world, or not really concerned about the problem of things that should exist in the real world and should serve a purpose there. Then I moved to London when I was around 19, already quite clear in my mind that that's sort of path that I was exploring somehow, making art with a computer, but started becoming also very interested in contemporary art, and I mean, here there's a photo of Gursky, which I think it's been incredibly inspirational for me, both this photo and in general his work. You know, what I like about his work, that there is this kind of different concept of photography. It's not really about documenting reality, rather it's about constructing images that really don't have so much to do with the reality that we live, that we see. It's really like a different way of looking at the world, a completely detached way. Its subjects are very, very different from the way you actually experience them there. And this kind of detachment really is something that inspired me a lot, and I think it was somehow, again, already rooted in the way maybe I was looking at architecture with a bit of detachment, perhaps. Also, again, very interested in technology. By nature, what I'm doing, it's kind of started also with me playing around with technology, but also became and still am incredibly influenced by how this incredible pace of how technology is really changing the way we look at the world. And one project that really struck me, that I really got kind of lost into it, was this initial project by Google about scanning these images, these paintings, these masterpieces in a museum. They essentially scan in incredibly high resolution these paintings, and then you have this interface to be able to navigate these paintings a bit like you would navigate a map. So essentially, you're looking at these paintings in a way you're not really supposed to. And again, this kind of misuse of the painting in a way, it's something that really fascinated me. Again, another way of looking at something in a very different way from how you look at it or how you experience it in real life. And this new way of looking at it, perhaps at these microscopic details, looking at a painting like it is a topographic map, like it is a landscape, really opens, I think, a whole new dimensions to it. So really, my work a lot has to do with how I observe things, how I look at things. And the systems I develop essentially are tools and opportunities to look at things in a different way. One of these strands that I wanted to talk about is iconography and the sort of classical image. It is strange because this actually is what I escaped from when leaving Rome, and really with a clear idea of not really doing this or exploring something that was so far from this. But actually, when being in London and going back to Rome, then I started becoming, again, incredibly fascinated by these images. But again, probably because I was looking at this in a very different way. So I started this project called Strata series, where I started photographing and, let's say, capturing data or digitizing, I don't know what's the good term for this, series of masterpieces from architectural frescoes and ceilings, like you can see in this image, for example, which it's almost like a sort of flat projection, something that you cannot really achieve with a single photo. It's essentially a texture being mapped onto a geometry. It's an image of this ceiling very, very different from the kind of perspective or the way you could really experience this. So went my interest from kind of exploring these sort of large architectural surfaces to also kind of delve down into the microscopic, using similar techniques of this kind of Google ultra high resolution images. I started collaborating with different institutions to digitize these paintings, really exploring the sort of very finest tiny details. And all this data, all these photographs, all these kind of scans, digitization process, for me was essentially the sort of beginning of a further analysis, further process. So I started employing different set of kind of computer vision algorithms to analyze further, almost observe further these images. Observe these images in a way that it's not bound to their iconographic narrative. This is something when I was in art school in Rome. I remember they used to let us copy these famous paintings, but upside down. So you would actually have a painting or a drawing, but they put it upside down, and we have to copy it upside down. Because somehow, like that, you're not really influenced by this kind of narrative that your brain cannot stop to see, in a way. It's almost like some kind of strange limitation you have. When you're looking at something, you tend to see this kind of story, this kind of narrative. Something that I really hate, or somehow see a bit of a strange limitation. I'm actually interested in the pure visual characteristics of something, and perhaps avoiding to see this kind of iconographic layer, especially on something where it is by nature so iconographic, then suddenly you discover new things. So the idea of this project, of the Strata series, is essentially this. It's essentially looking through the eyes of these machines at these paintings, removing completely these iconographic layers, and you're just left with these objects. I mean, these are some of these artifacts that then became kind of physical again. They are sort of computational drawings on anodized aluminum. Kind of remind me of some sort of imaginary sort of reverse engineering process, almost a preparatory drawing that has been, again, reproduced and reimagined by this machine. Here is a kind of recent experiment. What I'm showing you, it's not really so much in a sort of chronological order, it's a bit mixed, but this one, it's actually a sort of fairly recent experiment. So feeding some of this data as a way to control a laser to burn the canvas. And you have this sort of slight brownish color that really remind you of this kind of historic preparatory drawing called in Italian sinopie that you used to do before creating the work. So I'm kind of interested in almost creating sort of speculative archaeological objects in a way. These are some kind of new archaeological findings for me. Other works have been exploring color. For example, this one also from the Adoration from Botticelli, for example, where again different aspects of this painting has been reproduced and translated into geometry and a set of color palette. And for me, it's really not so much only about the work that I produce, but rather the tension between the new work and the original. It's almost, if you look at these things that are the kind of opposites in our sort of visual culture. One side is a sort of figurative, sometimes religious, iconographic painting. On the other, you have these digital abstractions, but actually they share the very same rules behind how the image is actually composed. So essentially, it's a way to translate this with a sort of uninterested eye of the machine. The machine doesn't quite care about the narrative, the iconography in that image. The way it looks at this image is completely different from the way we look at it. And that's what I'm fascinated about. A lot of these works also became, or by nature, started as animations. I'm going to show you a short excerpt of one of these. My relationship to video also, I guess, it's changed over time, but generally there's always been this idea of a video that is not so much something that has a beginning or an end, as a linear experience, but rather more like as an object of contemplation. And even if a video by nature is this kind of ephemeral digital thing, the physicality of it, the sort of physical manifestation of the video, it has been still is a crucial aspect of what I do. There is a lot of care and work into creating these video installations, these environments that then become very sculptural, almost architectural, and somehow you start relating really with these video objects in a very different way. Again, not so much as a linear experience, but really as something truly physical. This one, for example, is a photo of an installation I did in New York in 2007, and you can see the very same ceiling I showed you before. So how some of this data that I capture over time then continuously keep becoming different things. So there's been several installations that I made that sort of travel a bit around the world in many different formats. But in many cases, also I've been exploring relationship with historical buildings and really playing with this idea of sort of very thin boundary between what is real and what is artificial, perhaps the relationship between this projected object and the context itself. I started really becoming interested by this idea that you cannot quite separate the two, and the experience changed quite drastically. This is why I guess you can see some very short excerpts on my Vimeo, like the one that I showed you, but actually the real installation, it's quite, I think, a different experience. Talking about, I guess, this tension between different narratives, or the kind of balance between, again, form and matter. I think really there are no objects in the history of art that really embeds this idea more than these unfinished sculptures from Michelangelo. And that I've always been obsessed with this, and over the years became kind of more and more as they really, I think, embed some principles that I try to explore with my work already in their own. It's almost if, because they were left unfinished, because of this matter around these figures, suddenly the focus of your attention really shifts. It's not so much about this figure, what these characters are doing, but rather it's about the articulation of matter itself. And really the tension between this idea of form and matter that really fascinates me. So I decided to do a project to experiment with this very concept, and perhaps experiment with this with the space that essentially exists around the sculpture, or let's say between the edge of an imaginary bounding box, a sort of block of matter, and the figure. So my interest, it wasn't really into sculpting a figure, but rather explore the infinite possibilities that are between this block and this figure. And originally this project started as well, purely digital exploration. Do you think I could get a cold beer? Maybe. I think it's possible to actually, because I'm a little bit thirsty. Thank you very much. So originally, again, in my mind, this project was about creating a video or documenting these sort of processes purely digitally. But then, and in fact, this project started as a series of animation. This space was actually animated. I also made a video about this, but I didn't bring it. But I also realized that actually there was a very interesting quality about this object as static form in a sort of really three-dimensional way. I started kind of exploring the idea of maybe fabricating this. So that's when I started working with with robots. Yeah, let me show you a quick video. So here I started collaborating with different fabricators and engineers to kind of develop ways to somehow reproduce some of these geometries, some of these concepts in a sort of physical form. What you see here is just a block of polystyrene. The video has been sped up a little bit, so it's actually a slightly slower process. There was a sort of huge component of being very naive at the time. You know, when you work with a computer and you solve complex problems inside a computer, you somehow think that operating machines that are also controlled by a computer. Hey, thank you very much. Hey, how are you? So I thought generally it was slightly easier process, but actually it proved to be a quite complex problem, especially because these objects somehow only made sense at a certain scale. Things only made sense if made out of a single block. So I've experienced and made several of these objects. One has been shown here in Frankfurt, actually, also 2 years ago, couple, 2 or 3. But in the end, in the process of making all these pieces, and I think somehow also failing into reproducing accurately what I was really designing on a computer, I actually started to fall in love really with the machine. Not so much with the finished result, but actually again also there with all these stages in between. And what I think is fascinating about the stages in between is that a little bit like you see the chisel marks on those original marble unfinished sculptures from Michelangelo. So like this, you see this kind of marks of these robots on these objects. You kind of see this sort of logic that it's very, very unique, but you see the sort of process embedded into the geometry, which was something I was very, very intrigued. So I started sort of shifting strategy into how to work with these machines, rather than designing an object and then try to program a machine to reproduce it. Actually, I started directly by, I don't know how it's going to end, this thing, but I started just purely programming the robot. So what you see here are geometries generated by a simulation of how the robot moves. It's not something that has been actually designed. So the sort of complexity that you reach in this geometry, which are quite complex, somehow it's also incredibly efficient. It's essentially the nature itself of how this machine works. So a little bit like you saw those kind of topology experiments in the previous works, where I've been dealing with these variations of resolutions, let's say. Here also there's a similar strategy into dealing with resolution in different ways, but here the sort of unit is not so much the element of a mesh, a triangle, but actually the tool of the robot itself. And by changing tools and changing strategies of how these tools work, and by overlapping these kind of strategies, that you tend to have this complex object. But also, what I like about these, that are objects that embed the history of their creation. A bit exactly like these original unfinished ones. And so from this, then I started getting into the idea of not really exhibiting only the sculptures, but actually exhibiting the machine itself. So this one was the first of this Sculpture Factory series. where I exhibited a whole 7-axis CNC 6-ton kind of self-contained unit, because then also there is some aspects of also being very naive into being able to do something like that, that then obviously found some constraints along the way. But yeah, so over the years I didn't manage to do that many of these, but yes, hopefully more. But again, the idea was to really develop a sort of factory in itself, some kind of atelier where these infinite variations are sculpted live during the course of the exhibition. And again, this obsession of dealing, I mean, the results of these previous works, I think the real nice tension there, it's based on the fact that there are two elements that interact. You have this figure, and then you have this matter. And the interaction between these elements, between these different forces, I think it's what kind of creates this tensions, this equilibrium in this object. So I started actually exploring and looking at other sculptures that already embed this idea of these different forces operating. And decided to really kind of stick with the Laocoon. This one also, it's a very iconic sculpture. It's probably the most studied object in the history of art from the sort of Hellenic period, so very old. And it's interesting that there is a whole tradition that lasts for several centuries of studying the Laocoon. It's almost if there was the kind of benchmark for the academia to really prove yourself, to really understand how geometry worked. So in my own way, let's say I started this project fitting again in this kind of historic tradition of studying the Laocoon, but done also with a very different technological apparatus, digitizing this work, and then starting to replace some of these forces, some of these elements with different ones, perhaps replacing some of these narratives with non-narrative structures. So also here, and I guess this becomes clearer and clearer as you see this talk, but for me it was never been about making a sculpture, an object, a print, or a video. Again, it's about developing systems and explore iterations, explore possibilities. And the nature of working with such systems, it is about these many possibilities, not so much about the one. And this is really sort of fixed point in my work. I generally tend to develop things into series. I'm interested in developing things, these researches that have a lot of outputs. So here I designed obviously hundreds, thousands of these objects. Then unfortunately, I mean, there was the idea of making also tens of these, but for the moment there's only one being made. But this one kind of goes a little bit back to this idea of developing an object that has an aesthetic that actually it's much closer to the digital realm than the fabrication methodology in itself. So here it's a quite different kind of technique, much more work. This one also is made in marble, or let's say with a special material that has been developed also for this, made in about 80% pulverized white marble and 20% epoxy. So it's essentially some kind of resin. So an object that has been done into pieces and then assembled together is slightly more complex work. But for the moment, my sculpture experiments, they go a bit into ways. On one side, I am exploring more the expressiveness of these machines, of these robots, and really looking at that kind of aesthetic. And then on the other hand, bringing into the physical realm objects that by nature are belonging to a very different type of aesthetics, let's say. And also looking at the Laocoon, when you start kind of observing the Laocoon, you obviously realize that there is this part of the arm that it's much more broken than the rest. That's because there has been this kind of strange happening where when they dig this statue, this was actually at the time of Michelangelo during the Renaissance in Rome, there was one arm missing. And there was a lot of kind of speculation of what was the original position of this arm. In fact, if you go back, maybe you can see here, you see the position of the arm, it's actually in different ways, also in these various illustrations. There's been a lot of debates of, you know, where this arm goes. And then at some point, again, they found this arm, and it was actually in a very different position than what they thought. But this also, I think it's something that is really truly about Rome. It's a city that is been built on these layers. It's full of these kind of fragments of these broken objects all around the city that we preserve with such care. And it's another area that really fascinates me a lot. I find very, very inspiring. Because also in these fragments, you find this kind of double narrative. On one side, you have what this object once was, this figure, perhaps, what was the shape of this original object or the purpose of the story of this character. But then on the other hand, you have embedding a sort of process, the kind of forces and conditions that led to this object to break, the kind of physical manifestation of some forces, gravity or so on, collisions that led to these objects to break. So again, it's an object that embeds a sort of process of its creation or perhaps of its destruction. But something that kind of interests me very much. And I started another series about the Lacoon, but not so much exploring the space around it, but rather exploring the space inside the sculpture and simulating different ways in which this object might have broken down, perhaps. And from this, I started making a series of kind of speculative archaeological findings, kind of new fragments, perhaps, with kind of new imaginary narratives of how this sculpture might have, broken down, perhaps, or the kind of pieces that might have been digged. So I made several of these and kind of shown in many different ways, but generally I really like the idea of showing them almost with some kind of formal approach, like a real archaeological object. The first one, in fact, like that one with a white background, were made with a sort of rod that you can literally place on this base. But then the latest ones, I really fabricate them without any hole, so you can then collect them and then find your own way of positioning them like a real fragment. These ones are also made with a custom material that we kind of experimented with. This one is made with 80% pulverized iron and 20% epoxy, so also a kind of cold casting method. But the original ones are 3D printed, and then casted, with this material. And then, because essentially there's a high iron component, then it's been treated with some acid. So this rust, it's actually a real patina that happens with some chemical process. Another area, well, this also, it's a bit of a peculiarity of my presentations that generally never really, there is a beginning, but there isn't really an end to it. Sometimes I put some black slides so they allow me to stop at some point. So generally, I kind of continue to talk about things, but there isn't really a sort of end to this. So now I am sort of steering to a different place, but all the stuff that you see before, they're all series of works that are all in parallel, kind of continuing in a way or another. But another, theme for me, on one side separate, but on the other also quite connected with the one I just showed you. It's about nature, about landscape, but specifically about the relationship historically of nature and landscape in art, in our visual culture. Especially, I'm very interested in the sort of modern tradition, kind of late 19th century experiments with landscape painting, And this idea that the landscape started to serve as a point of departure towards abstraction. Like all the real kind of true breakthrough of visual aesthetics and new languages somehow happen while painting landscapes. All the avant-gardes and artists that became true abstractions, artists in a way they started by painting landscapes. And this has always been, I guess, a topic, a little bit like those unfinished sculptures from Michelangelo, something that I kind of felt very, very close. So I started observing and kind of studying, getting into many different landscape painters. And for example, Van Gogh, especially the last period of his life, where he kind of moved to Provence and started obsessively to paint the same thing, the same landscapes, the same subjects, but more and more detaching from them, kind of being less and less about representation and more about kind of delivering a sort of inner vision. So again, we go back to this idea of kind of detaching from how you see what you see and somehow try to go beyond that dimension. In a similar way, also the work of Monet, and especially the one at the Orangerie in Paris, another kind of example of these works where the landscape really becomes almost like a pretext to discover something else. Again, it's an area where I think very close to some of my way of operating, some way of exploring, or let's say looking at the world, this idea of detaching from things. So I started this project not so much based on the paintings themselves, but actually going back to the very same places that they paint. Almost looking at a similar modus operandi of going there, having a relationship with this landscape, this kind of en plein air painting style where you go outdoor and confront this landscape, but doing that with a very different technological apparatus and looking. I spent some time in Provence, in this area where Van Gogh used to live the last period of his life, and again also in the gardens of a castle in the Loire Valley, in Chamon-sur-Loire, and again approaching this kind of outdoor painting with a sort of very different apparatus, with different types of machines, capturing these images in ways our eyes cannot really see or not really able to see, I guess. And on the other hand, computationally, I started developing different techniques of digital paintings, of developing ways in which I could somehow reproduce. Well, it started by trying to reproduce very specifically brush strokes, and then slowly moved into techniques that got nothing to do with brush strokes. They don't try to simulate that, but end up with results that essentially are as expressive as. So this is an example of one of these Provence landscapes that then is transformed by these algorithms. So really this project kind of plays with this idea of what is the relationship between representation and abstraction. Where is the fine line between the two? Something that generally in the history of art has always been so separated. It's almost kind of two completely different fields. But actually, this moment in time when they start overlapping and when they move from one to the other, I find it very fascinating. I find very fascinating kind of moving in between this fine edge. So I'm going to show you another quick video. All these videos are pretty short, but they kind of give you an idea. that you observe almost like a landscape, not so much like a video. And actually, this whole project, yeah, it has probably been the first time that I managed to kind of step away from working with geometry in a way on a computer. I mean, I always tend to see my work based in a way or another to geometry, and actually here it's the first time that finally I'm working on a two-dimensional texture. I'll show you a little bit, some bits of how this stuff is made. Here are some images of the work shot in the gardens. This piece, well, it's the latest in the series and has been shot at night. And you can see these images that somehow tend to be sort of ambiguous, that you don't really know if the image itself is actually computer generated or not. It's this idea of achieving these hyper-realistic images that have a certain kind of lighting and colors that are kind of different from the one that you see. And this was a little bit the theme of this work on these gardens. So the previous ones you saw starting these kind of sequences from these landscapes and slowly reaching this kind of abstraction. But actually these ones work the other way around. They start from sort of blank canvas and slowly they are built until you reach this kind of visualizations. But you're really left, when you see this visualization, without really knowing if these are actually also computer generated or not. Let me show you also another video, but this is not a full sequence. Compressed clip, but actually the work in itself is in about 4 times HD resolution, all in 4K, shot actually in 8K. So actually when you see it at the right quality, again, you tend to relate to it very, very differently than what you see now. But you saw in both videos this kind of motion, this motion that these paintings have that is kind of inherited by the motion of these plants. And essentially that's how the whole system works. So yeah, let me show you a little kind of breakdown videos. Generally in my presentation I don't kind of dig into any technical things, but maybe we can also have a chat in a bit and I don't know, talk a little bit about this if you're interested. But here it's a little bit of a breakdown of, you know, one of these. So the whole research behind this project was actually quite extensive in a way. It started with some techniques that I had in mind, which are partly inspired by these sort of errors that you have sometimes with old DVDs or cheap MP4 videos. You might have seen sometimes maybe when you're streaming a video or watching something out of an old DVD that maybe you get a cut where suddenly the screen becomes kind of gray, but you still have the motion. You know, you have these strange things where you see one color, but you see the motion of, of the real motion. And so that was partly the kind of techniques explored in here. This idea of extracting motion from the original video and using this motion to drive this kind of deformation on this kind of simulations. Then this one's obviously it's different layers of fluid dynamics and stuff. But generally speaking, is the data that comes from the image itself. So in order to be able to shoot these images that are moving correctly, that are generating the correct data, essentially the system was developed beforehand, before going and actually shoot the videos. So really it's kind of interesting how the landscape becomes almost like an interface to control these systems in a way. It's a little bit also kind of inspired by Monet, where at some point he started planting his own plants. Basically started not just painting nature, but as soon as he realized what things were working, he started engineering his own gardens, essentially, and became a gardener as well. So I think this kind of feedback loop, to me, it's very important in what I do. Sometimes I make this analogy between making a movie and making a documentary. So both of them deals with video. The output of both of them, it's essentially a video, it's similar, but the process of how you perhaps approach making a movie to making a documentary, it's very, very different. You know, a movie is something where you have a script, you have an idea that is really the core, where everything revolves around, everything is very planned on this original idea. A documentary is a process of discovery. There is a ground that you want to explore, but the exploration itself leads to what the documentary is about. It's only when you go and edit in the end that you look at all the things that you made. You cannot really script a documentary, or in most cases, let's say. So something like this applies, I think the similar kind of logic is not starting from a specific image that I have in mind, but rather a certain process, and by developing this process, sometimes the order in which things happen, it's also interchangeable and very, very dynamic. But this place, it was also one of the kind of key generators of these ideas, really. Being in this environment for me has been really special, and it's a place in Paris. Every time I go, I try, not always, but I try to go back, and I really suggest you to go. It's this kind of immersive environments designed specifically for these paintings. So these paintings have been taught as this kind of spatial experience. And similarly, that's how I thought about this sort of computational paintings that I made. Again, not so much as something that has a kind of linear output that you see as a movie, but rather as a space that you explore, almost as a kind of series of gardens that you're able to move through. And this one is an image, well, about the actually very first installation of this project. But also, in the process of making this work, actually, or making this very first work, I kind of discover another best friend, which is this sort of high-resolution laser scanner, sort of a laser measurement kind of device. Again, when I had this idea of going into the landscapes to capture data, I also thought of capturing data relating to geometry, and I brought with me this device, which I never used. I had to do some kind of training course to learn how to use. In the end, it's pretty simple. But so I started gathering this data without even knowing exactly what this data would what I would do with this data. And actually, in fact, I didn't do much with this data until very recently. I had all this data, but I could see there was a potential, but there was also a kind of complexity to it that it's very difficult to deal with. But there is something kind of very interesting about this, that also in my mind always look at tradition. I tend to find some comparison into this idea of detaching from what you see and maybe an aesthetic that perhaps more loosely describes something but in a very different way, but could also be as equally expressive. And I start to become really fascinated by this different type of technology that start to capture the environment around us very differently than a camera, than a video, with a very different logic. Very similarly to what is happening to the sort of self-driving vehicles kind of arena, where essentially there are these machines driving around that have a perception of the world around them that is incredibly different than ours. So we are actually very used to drive. We do them all the time. But the way we see, it's incredibly different from the way this machine see. Exactly the same thing with exactly the same purpose, let's say. Which I find this kind of incredibly inspiring, and it was part related to this new project I am developing. So I've been kind of gathering a lot of data using these scanners, and more recently started making a video, a new video piece. Well, it's still a bit in the making, really about this kind of alternative way of looking. I'm somehow interested in the kind of logic spatially of how these algorithms understand space, the way they really understand the geometry around you. So here are some kind of still frames of some of these bits and pieces of work of this new piece. I mean, it's still in the making, so I'm going to show you a sort of short excerpt. It's called Promenade. Maybe potentially could become a series, I don't know, about this kind of machines taking a promenade. So on one side I'm making this video which is really it's employing drones, so we've been flying drones into these landscapes, same landscape that we scanned, and then somehow trying to find a kind of this relationship between these two different ways of looking. But also with the scans, something happened that is very different from shooting a video on a location. When you shoot a video or you take a photo, generally you have this kind of direct moment where you're grabbing a point of view, you're deciding the way you're looking at this. But when you scan this data, the true exploration comes afterwards. It's almost if what you do on location is basically gathering data, measuring things. But actually the true work of the photographer, let's say, of the artist that goes and finds things, it's done afterwards in a computer. And this is this project that I've been running for a while, which essentially involves exploring these 3D scans and then creating ultra high resolution prints, rendered still images that they kind of look a little bit like this, from sort of far away they look almost like a photo in a way. They have this kind of tangible quality and that kind of complexity. But actually up close, these objects are made by hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions, of tiny little geometry. So there is a sort of interesting combination between this granular complexity, but also logic of this machine, interpreting these patterns, interpreting this very complex geometry. And then as soon as you start looking out from this, then you end up in a sort of way of visualizing this that it's much closer to us. And I've been exploring ways of presenting this. This has also been what it has been tricky in a way, because a screen has a very limited amount of pixels. It's very difficult to display this kind of immense data sets like this. So I started working with rendering these images at resolutions that are far, far, far beyond what you can see on a screen, what you can capture with a camera. Maybe a camera, maybe the best of the best cameras nowadays can capture around 100, 120, maybe 150 megapixels. These are renders that done at 1,200 megapixels. They're like a very different kind of scale of size. And this allows an image that can be very, very large in scale, can be printed very large, but also can be explored as close as like if you are reading a book, essentially. So it becomes this very, very big object that you can explore kind of spatially. I don't have really, these are slightly older ones, so they're not very big, these ones, but just recently I presented in Hong Kong some of the very big ones, and I'm starting now to produce this sort of large, almost altarpieces kind of objects. So I think again here there's a relationship between the physicality of the work and these digital artifacts that I produce. It's not just about creating an image and printing it, or creating a geometry and milling it. I think it's really about having a conversation with the right, about scale, about perception, about how people really are going to experience this. And for these kind of works with these high-resolution prints, it took actually a very long time to figure out really the right relationship between the original size, scale of the landscape, the resolution of the scanning, the size of these granular sort of particles, and ultimately the size of the print. And then I've established a sort of fixed proportion of these elements, and now I'm making very small prints, which involve very small portion of a landscape, and very, very large prints that involves very big portion of the landscape. And now I'm kind of starting to develop this whole new series. And yeah, I think here we reach one of these black things I was telling you before. There isn't really a conclusion as all this stuff. It's all in progress, it's all in the making, and don't really have an end. But perhaps maybe we could open this in a more, I don't know, two-way kind of conversation. If you have any, I don't know, questions or... Before I'm drunk, actually. Yes, kind of thing. I mean, originally the idea was the first one we shot on location, these landscapes, and it was very complex. We had to wait for very, very, very strong winds. It wasn't really feasible to plan a big shoot with a lot of people waiting for wind, so there I started thinking about creating a sort of laboratory and I started working with a sort of florists, botanical people and so on to develop this thing. I had a bit of money for that project, and but then when I started experimenting, I realized that the type of compositions I was looking for, maybe we can find them. Let's go very fast back if I don't break it, sorry. Yeah. The compositions I was looking for, I think they need to add a certain kind of complexity, and it is actually quite difficult to create this type of complexity when you're, artificially making it, especially because complexity generally happens when things are let there and let grow together. So suddenly, the level of difficulty and costs into imaging to engineer these gardens was far much greater than bringing a truck to a different country with a lot of people with an entire set to places. But this happened by chance because I did an exhibition before in this castle, and then I was supposed to shoot this project in London in like 3 weeks' time or something like that, so it was very imminent. And then they invite me in this castle for this dinner. They did this artist dinner, they invited some artists, they did this. So I go there, and I walk around this castle, and suddenly I said, oh, fuck, this is perfect, actually. They have these incredible compositions that are far much nicer than what I could possibly do. So in the end, it's also by seeing something that then you click that is right. Also, something very complicated was how plants are moving. I mean, in the end, this whole thing only works if you have a complex kind of motion. So if you have an object that moves, yeah, it's strange. There aren't parameters that can be explained so objectively, but somehow, depending on the structure of these plants, they tend to move in a slightly irregular way, and this is what created complexity. So we shot a huge amount of data. Some videos are incredible, but in the end they didn't generate data that was interesting enough for the motion, for example. So it really goes. Just this project alone was around, I think, 37 terabytes of data. Just this alone. So data also, it's a problem of this kind of high resolution sequences. It's funny because it's a question that I always have. I should have some slides to just explain this. But sound, it's a very important aspect of what I do. You can see that it's present in every video, and it is not something that you can actually separate even from the videos. It really depends from project to project. I think in some projects there is systems that are developed that follow certain kind of logic that sometimes is very similar to the logic of how we generate the images, and then these systems control the sounds, for example. Sometimes it is incredibly traditional. Sometimes it's more music-driven. Sometimes there is a whole other body of work which the subject of my visualization is sound itself. So there's different ways in which I'm looking at sound. But after experimenting a lot and working in many different directions, I mean, I would say that not necessarily developing such complex systems result into sound that it's more accurately connected to the images. Because in the end, there is a choice that you make when representing sound. Like if you imagine a movie, you don't even think about it because it's done so well that it's just the sound of the movie. Like you don't even think that there is something separate. But when they make a movie, most of the sounds, they're not recorded on set, they're added. And if in like Lord of the Rings you have a big battle, It's not that they have computational systems to drive every single characters. They could easily connect sounds to every single characters. They can easily do this automatically, but it would just sound like noise. But when you see the scenes of these battles, you see this guy, you hear the single guy breathing, even if it's a big crowd of people. And it's that breathing of that guy that makes it, that sells it in a way. So I think with sound and image, there is a whole universe there, but not necessarily building such correct synchronization between the two. It's more expressive in a way. So for this project, for example, I've been working with very traditional, I mean, some aspects are similar. I mean, there are real sounds that are then processed, let's say, a little bit like this. But I work with a very traditional guy that works in the movie industry, where makes sounds for, you know, this and that, and you know, with the movie of Pinocchio, he made the sound of the growing of the nose with the wood in a way and stuff like that. So there is a lot of research into movies, into really developing complex sculptural sounds. So I worked with this guy to develop this kind of textures, as I just didn't want to record plants moving, but it was, I think, a bit more complex, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And also another thing, like another question that I saw an interview that you had.
Okay, but let's do one at a time, otherwise I forget. This one, I think it's a good point in the sense that also the presentation of my work, it is very much inspired by these formal, traditional outputs of the arts I am referring to. So very often I create this kind of comparisons and try to show the work with some kind of aura around or space for this type of contemplation. Then it is very different. I mean, a print, a sculpture has a fixed size. So the relationship you have with size is really related to the work itself, not so much where the work goes, or it depends, but generally, if you're producing an object, then this object is a physical thing that stays, and that is a whole universe in its own, because when you just produce a digital image and you print it, generally tends to look better on your screen than when you print it. It takes a lot of work to actually print something that looks better, that has a reason to exist more in that format, and I think you get into that when you start looking at images that on your screen, they don't look very good, but actually they look good when they're printed. So I think that's where, so it takes a lot of work. I think it's like if you're an experienced architect, when you're designing a building, you already foresee or imagine the kind of scale and the relationship people will have with this. If you haven't done this so much, then you will design something only when you build it, you realize maybe you could have done some stuff differently. So I think it's an iterative process. For the videos, it's very different, because a video is something that doesn't have a fixed scale, and generally when I am invited to make an exhibition, I start from the space. So I tend to ask for specs of the space, and then start from there to think about the relationship and the scale and how the space should be. Sometimes you need to build spaces in order to show the video in a correct manner. It's not a matter of scale, it's a matter of proportions, and it's a matter of, I guess, relationship between space and this object. With video, I think it's just a bit more difficult, because otherwise it looks like a video, and that loses all its, you know, this, when you look here, it looks like a projected video on a wall. doesn't look very good. I think when you look at the right setup, then you really forget that there is a projector. You forget there is a video. It's just an object that you really get into it. It's like when you go to the cinema, or if you put a projector at home, you know, it's a slightly different, the quality of these projections and the scale and the brightness and the lighting condition, it's, you know, that's why like THX was born. It's like a set of specifications for how the cinema should look and sound. It's not so easy to interesting. Yes, I think that there are different levels, and this works differently in I guess the different works. I mean, for example, what you see here. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure I know what you mean, but I'll try to imagine this. I think, as I was saying before, for me, it's not so much about the work that I create, but also about this kind of narrative that exists between the original and what I generate. This happens in different levels in my work, and I guess what I display as my work sometimes is different moments in time of this kind of translations, let's say. For example, those lines drawings that I show you on this aluminium, it's a sort of stage in which you really lost completely this relationship. You are not able to understand. The only way you are able to understand is from the title. So these works have the title of the original. So somehow only by reading this title, but the title is crucial in the end. So you already have this context of. I think it's a narrative in the end that it's important. I think this narrative is kind of crucial, that in some cases it is very literal. For example, in the video where you see this kind of transformation happening from the painting to these abstractions and going back, to moments where it's less literal or showing something that it's a different kind of stage of abstraction. Or for example, this kind of works where I'm only taking reference to a modus operandi, to a way of working, but not necessarily to a specific image. For me, this context, this relationship with the past, it's I think an interesting context to really understand how much our way of looking at the world has changed, how much machines have changed us in how we experience what's around us. It's my way, maybe because I'm born there, and that's, I think, where I come from, a way of looking at something so primordial that has been there, that is rooted in our visual culture in such a different way that you start to really understand how different this way of looking at things is. I like this kind of contrast between opposites. It's a bit generally something present in everything I do. I'm interested in these relationships between opposites. But I'm not sure if it answer, but okay. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, as that was one of the reasons why it took so long to develop this project. It's because these imperfections, and because I started to fall in love with these imperfections. In a similar way, like this robot sculpting process, I liked more the imperfections that were coming out while sculpting rather than the final geometry that I've designed. This comes, I think, a bit as a dialogue about getting intimate with machines. You start to understand how they operate. So the story there was to capture data in the most accurate way without really knowing much about how to do this. And only when processing this data, I started to fall in love with areas that perhaps had more of these imperfections. And what happens there, I think, I started falling in love with this tension between this complexity of the natural pattern and the impossibility of the machine to reach this, or perhaps the very different logic of which the machine tries to do that. A little bit like how my algorithms were looking at these paintings and trying to retrieve this, but in the process of failing, they discover something else. So I think in a similar sense, when you start projecting these lasers in this very complex geometry, you tend to have these incredible patterns that develop that really suggest a logic that I think is very poetic. It really starts to, again, create this narrative of this machine that tries to understand this landscape. The problem is that when you, let me show them again, where are they? The problem is that in order to see these details, you need to be very, very close in. But when you're very, very close in, you tend to lose the whole point of this, or this kind of different dimension that is more similar to this photographic image. So it took a while to figure out that in the end, it wasn't something that could exist on a screen and had to exist on this very different format. Just wondering if that was a black slide or maybe there was another video. I think it's... because I have also like a little video of this, but I don't think it's that. It's a bit of a combination of things, and I think also there's different aspects between authorship, control, and I think generally as the work goes forward, I try to engage in a certain kind of purity into the systems where maybe are less overworked, but by nature reflect a bit more the narrative that I want to explore, let's say. But yeah, on one side, I think, yeah, I guess that there's different areas. I mean, for example, if you think about a camera, you know, when you talk about photography, the technique, the technology is so simple, or let's say simple, but it's, you know, it's pretty basic, that generally you tend to talk about the photographer rather than the camera, like how you really use the camera. Nobody gives a fuck about how you really use the camera, because in the end it's a simple tool. It's only when you maybe talk about slightly more complex things that you tend to also investigate that. But ultimately, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, in the end, you have a certain tool, but then your point of view on this tool, the kind of level of control you have over this tool, it's how you use it, what you see, what you make with it. Personally, there is this kind of level of control in my work that it's somehow a little bit traditional in a sense. Like I develop a lot of these systems that are, they have many different kind of generative strategies and ways in which they have kind of intelligence of their own. But actually, I see these more like instruments than systems that develop their own works. So generally what I tend to do, it's about developing systems, sometimes with the help of like engineers and people like that. And these systems are a bit like a music synthesizer. Then that's the starting point to make it. So for example, in a similar sense, to answer your question, you could make a similar metaphor, the one of the camera to the one to the synthesizer. I mean, okay, you can build your synthesizer or you can buy it, whatever. Of course, you're bound to a certain piece of technology that will bring a certain kind of aesthetics, but ultimately, it's the work of the composer starts when the synthesizer is finished and built in a way, and then you. So, I think it depends. But in my systems or in these projects, let's say there is about maybe 15% of the time, 20% maximum of time that goes into building such tool, building such pipelines and workflows. And all the rest of the time, it's actually about tweaking numbers, basically tweaking the knobs of a synthesizer to reach something that has value. So in that sense, the amount of effort that goes into calibrating things to reach something that somehow works, it's far greater than developing tools in the end. With the scanner, it's slightly different. It's very, very raw, what I'm doing. I'm scanning something, I'm rendering it with somehow almost default sunlight setups. I mean, okay, it's not quite like that. It's actually pretty complicated to render, this kind of size of images. There goes a lot of technology into that. But the rendering itself, and I am not really intervening that much. But to discover, again, the right relationship between the scanner, how to use the scanner, the resolution, the size, the scale of these objects, the scale of these dots. Something that sounds so simple actually took very, very long time, and I think sometimes even simple things to look right, there is a lot of research into that. So I'm sure that if you take a LiDAR and capture this data, and then suddenly sit there on your computer with several billion points, it becomes a big problem to figure out what to do with this data, how to look through it. That goes even without saying by finding meaningful things within that data sets. So some of this stuff looks simple, but actually it is. And even to me, in a naive way, in my mind originally things look simple. That's why I start doing them, because I think that I can kind of get away with it, and then in the end it ends up being nightmares. I mean, this stuff are, I don't know, 15, 20 gigabytes per image that takes several weeks to render on like supercomputers, and it's taking, a year and a half to be able to even render this stuff. So even sometimes technically, some of the stuff you are really confronted with limitations. File formats do not exist to support this kind of scale of images. You end up in problems that you haven't even thought of. So yeah, there's I think different levels of complexity. We go to Robert Johnson now.